Resuming debate, the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to rise today to speak to the second budget Implementation Act for Budget 2018. Of course, this one, like its predecessor, is quite a large budget implementation act with a lot of different things to talk about, and I'm going to try and spend more time on one aspect of the bill as opposed to trying to cover all the many aspects of the bill in 10 minutes because I think if one takes that approach, there's really just not enough time and one risks not really saying anything of substance at all, Mr. Speaker, which is part of the problem with having budget implementation acts of this size. I know the member who spoke previously offered as I think a pretty meek or timid defense of these kinds of massive budget implementation acts that, you know, there's a lot in the budget, and therefore if we want to get all these things done, we have to put them all in one omnibus act. But of course that wasn't a justification that his party subscribed to when the previous government engaged in this kind of activity. So it's you know, kind of if one is trying to be charitable, it's passing strange that suddenly that is an acceptable justification, Mr. Speaker, but it's also not a very good one because it's quite obvious. I mean, for anyone who's looked at a budget document, they'll know that that's a document hundreds of pages long that signals many different policy intentions of government, some of them quite vague because they're not necessarily very well developed in time for the budget, and then to say later, oh, well, now we can do this because it had a passing mention in the budget, I don't think is quite fair. You know, so you get these kind of vacuous phrases like, well, we want to help the middle class, and then you see clauses in, you know, in an 800-some page budget implementation act that have nothing to do with anything that was discussed in an election campaign or even in that budget document. They say, well, you know, in our opinion, this helps the middle class, so it was foreseen in the budget, and it makes perfect sense, of course, to have it in the Budget Implementation Act. These arguments don't pass muster as far as we're concerned on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I felt it was important to begin just by acknowledging the problem with this kind of massive bill. If we get into the details of some of what's in the bill, and I'm going to use pay equity just as an example, Mr. Speaker, although I think the arguments that I'm going to make can be applied to various other types of measures that one sees in the Budget Implementation Act. One of the problems is that, you know, the size of the Budget Implementation Act notwithstanding, there's also the fact that these acts under this government have been heavily time allocated. And so in committee, when you're talking about a massive and important change, one that needs to happen when it comes to paying women fairly in this country, you want time to be able to make sure that you get the legislation right. And why do you want that? Well, it's not so opposition politicians can spend a whole bunch of time talking in the House. It's because, you know, just because the government drafted legislation doesn't mean it's perfect, doesn't mean that it does what it was intended to do, even with the best of intentions. And we know from the committee process on this bill that that a lot of flags have been raised by people who are strong advocates for pay equity, who have been waiting a long time for this legislation. And I think to their credit also have been working collaboratively as best they can with this government in the hopes that the government would get it right, and who were taking the government at its word that it wanted to see pay equity implemented in this country. And it was a long wait. I mean, it's been a long wait for Canadian women. It's been a decades-long wait. But it's been a long wait even within the life of this Parliament, because we're over 3 years in now, and we're only getting legislation now. There's no good excuse for that. In 2004, the Pay Equity Task Force of the day did this work and came up with model legislation, good legislation, in fact legislation that's seen internationally as the gold standard and has inspired and been the resource used in many other countries in order to implement pay equity there, long ahead of Canada, who commissioned the work. I mean, that's one of the ironies. And the legislation presented in this massive bill, which only got a limited amount of time at committee, which meant tough decisions about prioritizing what would be discussed, what wouldn't, where the effort to make amendments would go, and where it wouldn't. What that meant was that what was presented in this Budget Implementation Act didn't get the attention that it needs, particularly when people like the President of the Canadian Labour Congress are saying, hey, we've worked on pay equity for a long time, and this bill doesn't do it. And what that means for Canadian women is that they're going to end up back in court trying to straighten this legislation out through the court system, as opposed to having it done here where it should be done by people in good faith, and where it can be done a lot more quickly and a lot more cost effectively, because who's going to pay for those legal challenges? Well, if the government decides to defend its own inadequate legislation, then taxpayers are going to be asked to pay for the bad work of this government that could have been improved. So when amendment after amendment was presented in committee with the NDP, working with those same people that were working with the government in good faith over the last 3 years, trying to get them to present decent legislation, those amendments were voted down, Mr. Speaker. So, for instance, language in the purpose of the act that will establish pay equity, like, for example, the qualifying language, while taking into account the diverse needs of employers. I mean, that's nice to put in there. You can understand why it seems like a kind of common sense phrase, and that would be fine if you weren't talking about a fundamental right of Canadian women to be paid fair value for the work that they're doing. So you don't need that kind of language. What that kind of language allows is for so-called solutions that don't actually meet the bar of paying women fairly to be implemented under the auspices of this kind of caveat until it's challenged in court and found not to be consistent with the right of women in Canada to be to receive equal pay for work of equal value. So that's another years-long court battle. That's not going to happen for free. We're going to be paying for that battle when we could have been fixing it here. And in the meantime, Canadian women aren't going to be paying what they deserve, aren't going to be getting paid what they deserve to be paid for the work that we do. So there's a lot of frustration there. There's a lot of ways that we could have done better. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, in this legislation, we see language similar to Quebec legislation that says, when decisions are made about compensating women going back in the past for work that they've done and not been paid properly for, it will be done between the first pay equity review and then the 5-year review, limiting the period of compensation to 5 years. Again, I mean, you can see why some people would want that to be the case. It's not fair to Canadian women and we've known for decades that there's a problem. We've known this should have been addressed a long time ago, and then you wouldn't have huge retroactive payments, but it wasn't. People ought to have acted sooner. And in the case of Quebec, the courts found that kind of provision wasn't constitutional. It didn't respect women's right to be paid properly for the work that they do. So we already know that this kind of clause doesn't pass muster. We don't need to include it. We don't need to incite another long legal battle just to get to where we already should be. And it's frustrating to see that, above all, from a government that has said that it's led by a feminist prime minister, that it believes in pay equity. They made Canadian women wait 3 years for this legislation. We already know that this legislation isn't good enough. And we see similar frustrating hypocrisies, frankly, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the Canada Post strike. One of the major issues there is a pay equity issue. Mm-hmm. So the government passed through this House just on Friday back to work legislation above the objections of the union and certainly above our objections here as the NDP in the House. There's some terms of reference language around pay equity, but nothing that actually mandates pay equity for women working at Canada Post, as the court has said as recently as September they deserve. So we keep hearing time and time again from Canadian women, from Canadian workers, from Canadian courts, that this is something that needs to be dealt with. It needs to be dealt with now. It's a question of justice for Canadian women who for too long have been asked to do work of equal value without getting equal pay. We've got a government that says that that's what they want to do and they want to honor it, and yet when the time comes to actually get it done, we're left wanting. knowing that we're going to have to go back to those same courts that have already said Canadian women deserve fair pay, Mr. Speaker. So that's just one example of what's wrong with this bill. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my colleague's intervention today and how he spent a considerable amount of time talking about pay equity. We know that one of the most important things that we can be doing in order to achieve pay equity is making sure that the system in which we create for women is one that we don't put an overburden of raising children on women, and that we make sure that the right supports are there for childcare in particular, as we've heard time and time again. This government brought in early on in its mandate the Canada Child Benefit, which was a great change from the previous government in that it went to support women who needed, or families that needed it more than families that didn't. And I'm wondering if the member can comment on how he sees, the role of childcare in this discussion around equity in the workforce and pay equity as it relates to women specifically.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, early in their mandate, although it was introduced, it didn't get through right away. They brought in a repeal of Bill C-87. And then what we were hearing on Friday was that all of the things since that they've done that have been an assault on collective bargaining, whether it's the tight restrictions that they wanted to put on collective bargaining in Bill C-7 for RCMP members, or the back-to-work legislation that they rammed through on Friday, somehow should be forgiven because they got rid of Bill C-377. Early in their mandate, they brought in the child benefit, and they did something for low-income families. But the funny thing is, they didn't keep with the theme either. So if you look at the changes to parental leave under EI, how is it that the low-income families are going to be able to access that because they already have low incomes, they can't afford to live on 33% of their income. So the extended parental leave time is for who? Is it for low-income families that want to spend more time at home with their family, or is it for the high-income families that they said we're all supposed to be proud of them for taking on when they got rid of the original UCB? So this is the thing, early on, a couple things from their election commitments for workers and for low-income families, and then that's supposed to forgive everything else they do for their Bay Street buddies and big multinational companies, Mr. Speaker, and the evidence doesn't bear out that they're serious about helping real Canadians who are struggling every day.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I always enjoy hearing from the member. He has a lot to say, very good things to say. And I just would like to ask him, we're facing a scenario with this government where debts are rising, our deficit annually is way beyond what they promised, rising inflation, rising interest rates, billions are being lost in investment in Canada, and there's a crisis in our Canadian energy sector, and now today we learn of what's happening in Oshawa. I'm just wondering if the member has anything he would like to say in regards to the fact that this government just seems to insist that it can continue to borrow and to borrow against the future of our children and grandchildren.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for the floor, and thank you for the question from my colleague. It is a concern. I mean, probably where her and I would disagree is that the NDP believes that there are ways that we can mobilize the wealth of Canada in order to be able to help Canadians without incurring massive amounts of debt. And that's by ensuring that corporations pay their fair share. That's why in the last campaign, we talked about raising the corporate tax rate. We talked about closing the CEO stock option loophole, actually something that this government promised as well, and then changed direction on after they were elected to government. It's why we talk often in this place about closing the option that wealthy Canadians have to be able to use tax havens. And it's why we speak against the kinds of sweetheart tax treaties that Liberal and Conservative governments have signed with countries like Barbados and the Cayman Islands and others. So, definitely that is a concern here. And we often have said that, there's no great interest for your ordinary Canadian workers served by paying a lot of interest to banks of all people. But that means being honest about raising revenue in order to pay for the things that are going to help workers out. It also means having rules in place and expectations in place and enforced by contract when you provide bailouts, like the bailouts to GM, instead of letting corporate Canada walk all over you. But that wasn't done. There was no guarantee that in exchange for taxpayer money, GM was going to keep jobs in the country. And now we see the consequences of that today when we hear that there's going to be thousands of jobs leaving. Government is certainly not a piggy bank for corporate Canada. But unless we have governments that are going to impose, that actually have the courage to stand up to them and impose some limits on them, we're going to continue to see those kinds of problems arise.